At dawn this morning, the streets of Beijing looked and sounded like a war zone.
Among the most famous news pictures ever taken, these images of a man stopping a column of tanks would be instantly recognized anywhere in the world. Except in the country where this happened. China. The man who was angry enough to stand up to a row of tanks on the morning of June the 5th, 1989, has never been identified. His brave gesture followed a night of blood and fire as the People's Liberation Army used tanks and machine guns to put an end to weeks of demonstrations clamoring for political change. For 25 years now, pictures like these have been suppressed, along with any writing or discussion about the protests and the killings. The Communist Party is still afraid of the ideas which brought Chinese students out onto the streets in the spring of '89.
Today, the students showed organization and staying power. Show no signs of letting the government off the hook. The students have articulated profound public discontent.
Shen Tong was one of those students. Now a successful businessman in New York, he still has some of the idealism of 25 years ago and some hope for a democratic China, but not much.
I would like to believe that there's still a chance for a negotiated and peaceful and evolution of Chinese politics. But what happened in the last 25 years makes that more and more impossible.
What has happened in the past 25 years is breathtaking economic development, colossal corruption, and absolute resistance to political change. China's cities are unrecognizable, but the political landscape is depressingly familiar. Activists are locked up today for advocating exactly the same things that students were calling for in 1989. The Beijing Spring began when students used the safe cover of paying their respects to a deceased leader to call for political reform. The young Shen Tong measured his words.
And I also think the Chinese Communist Party is a good party, but the party have some faults. We must ask them to change.
Shen Tong and the other students besieged government offices and even the compound where party leaders lived, expecting to make their point, then go back to school. He was a reluctant leader until one night he noticed flickering lights around the campus.
And I remember that night, and the radio station is actually in my dorm room, broadcasting from the second floor window. And I remember I was exhausted. I came out of my dorm, and I see this little fires in the corridor. And it turns out those are students burning documents. And then my eyes adjust to the darkness, and then I see people bite their finger and write in blood their headbands.
The students were preparing for the next day's protest, expecting the worst.
It's transformative for me personally because I really harnessed that kind of determination, energy from them. You know, I was then known as the grumpy student organizer because I always thought, oh, we're going to end tomorrow. You know, it's just our responsibility to really minimize government suppression of the larger student body. I mean, I wasn't like go to the square, let's make it bigger, let's challenge the government.
As the demonstrations gathered momentum, disagreement on how to handle the situation led to a power struggle among top leaders. Supreme Leader Deng Xiaoping wanted to crack down. Party General Secretary Zhao Ziyang, the number 2 man, wanted to compromise with the students' demands.
The students have articulated profound public discontent in a way that's forcing China's leaders to take stock of the pace and direction of reform after a power struggle that's lasted for more than a year.
Professor Wu Guoguang teaches political science at the University of Victoria. Back in 1989, he was working for Zhao Ziyang's Office for Political Reform. He was on leave in the United States when the protests started. Like the students, he saw a window of hope for political change. But colleagues on the inside back in China told him the power struggle was likely to end in a violent crackdown.
Late April, I phoned back to the political reform office. I said, I would like to come back, actually, from the United States. And several colleagues of mine, they together, they shout, on the phone, said, don't do that. You don't know what is happening today in here in Beijing. So it could be very dangerous. So just stay there. They knew that, Deng Xiaoping was much more powerful than Zhao Ziyang.
Jan Wang was the Globe and Mail's Beijing correspondent.
I felt like it was going to be a turning point in Chinese history, that suddenly the Chinese people were asking for things like democracy and end to corruption. And that was really an exciting moment. I thought, okay, this country's going to change now.
The demonstrations got bigger and bigger. The crowds now in the millions as ordinary people joined in. And the students upped the ante time and again. They started a hunger strike, winning public support and paralyzing the government.
The hunger strike, a tactic not seen in China since the revolution, represents a new challenge for the authorities.
The government's inaction was read by the demonstrators as weakness. And what they didn't know was that behind the scenes, Deng Xiaoping was getting all his various military commanders on board. It was taking him a lot of time because it's ad lib. This has never happened before.
What amazed me at the time was the way the students could keep coming up with new twists to bring out huge crowds, poking fun at party leaders and making them seem impotent, an unforgivable loss of face. There were rumors the government might strike back, but Shen Tong still hoped it would agree instead to a televised dialogue.
Because we're patriotic and we're for reform, not for revolution, therefore government of course will respond to our request, which is at that time only one, that is to have a publicly televised dialogue with the students' representative. That was the formation of dialogue delegation. That was a single request, could have changed the whole protest.
On the night martial law was declared, Zhao Ziyang, knowing the hardliners had beat him in the power struggle, made a last effort to persuade the students to leave the square. He spent the rest of his life under house arrest.
I would say Deng Xiaoping decided to make, to do something like this, like a martial law, pretty early. He thought that, okay, Zhao Ziyang was trying to overthrow him.
Throughout, the protesters have been speaking with one voice, clamoring for reform. With the power struggle over, the government too is speaking with one voice, resisting change.
Martial law was greeted with contempt on the streets of Beijing. The protests were spinning further and further out of control.
I think there were many, many, many micro steps along the way where the massacre could have been avoided. The problem is that the students were dealing with a dictatorship, a one-party dictatorship that was not used to dialogue.
People had been flooding into the capital from around the country, wanting to share the excitement. It was easy to believe the protesters had the upper hand, as I reported during an apocalyptic storm in late May.
If China's leaders need any confirmation that martial law isn't working, all they have to do is look out of the windows of the Great Hall of the People. They seem to have as much chance of controlling this storm of protest as they do of controlling the weather.
Night after night, ordinary citizens joined in preventing the army units from moving in to impose martial law. The students capped weeks of exuberant defiance by erecting the goddess of democracy on the square.
The protesters have said all along that they're not challenging the Communist Party and the socialist system. But whatever they call it, this is the Statue of Liberty, symbol of the United States and its founding principles, unveiled as a rival to the icons of Communist China.
This was the first time I'd been to China, but I'd been covering communist countries for almost a decade, since the Solidarity movement in Poland. Some days I'd think the students might just pull this thing off.
Protesters consider they've won a great victory, and so they have.
Other times, watching their quarrels, their recklessness, and their unrealistic expectations, I'd worry about what chaos would come if they did. And always there was the nagging sense that the huge security apparatus had not yet spoken.
The government they're defying today is much more resistant to change than the one they challenged when they first walked out of the universities in the middle of April.
These were the days before cell phones, instant messaging, the internet, Twitter and Facebook, used in later people power uprisings. But a communique produced on a cumbersome Chinese typewriter spread through the city in minutes. It seemed to me that erecting an icon of American freedom in the political heart of China was a provocation too far. That the students should go back to their dormitories because the authorities were sure to react. But I believed that China, of all countries, had the manpower to regain control of the square without using lethal force. When we come back...
Oh, don't worry, it's rubber bullet. I'm sure it's rubber bullet, yeah.
How wrong we were. With disaster imminent, Shentong had been called away from the protests by a family crisis.
I was told by some family friends that my father had leukemia, and the family has been keeping that news away from me for weeks. And they felt, by telling me that I may actually perform my duty to be a son, not just a student activist.
Night of June the 3rd, he saw army units passing his home on their way to the square.
And I remember the first guy who got shot not far from me, and the crowd went crazy, and I tried to calm the crowd, say, oh, don't worry, it's rubber bullet. I'm sure it's rubber bullet. So just don't worry, don't panic.
Jan Wang pulled back from the square to a vantage point on a hotel balcony.
I get there just as the violence starts. I see the tanks coming in, they're shooting, and I see the bodies coming out because the Beijing hotel is on the way to 2 or 3 hospitals. So a lot of the wounded and the dying are coming out, and they're coming out not just in ambulances, there's not enough ambulances, so they're coming out on pedicabs, and it goes on all night because there's so many wounded.
Many believed the use of disproportionate force was calculated. The aim to put an end to hopes for democratic change once and for all. So far, it's worked.
Not only they succeeded in the short term, they succeeded in the long term in shocking the entire nation and say, we're not going that direction. You give me a little door of making money and making money only, and we're not going to talk about human rights, human dignity, and political reform.
Shentong was able to leave China just after the massacre, with emotional wounds that didn't begin to heal until he saw others drawing inspiration from the movement he'd been part of.
I couldn't stop crying, and just sitting by myself, right? And then I saw this sign. This is actually a couple of months later, and this is during the Berlin protests, right? And there's this huge sign a couple of people hold up and said, "No Tiananmen." right? And this happened again and again when I visited the Prague and even in Latin America, left-wing movement. People draw direct inspiration. It wasn't just a solidarity in spirit. People who wanted peaceful protest and change the country based on an impossible situation draw direct inspiration from Tiananmen. So I had no idea.
I felt very angry. I think I felt the same emotions they feel because I had gone to China as a teenager from Canada to learn Chinese in the middle of the Cultural Revolution. I had become a Maoist, a Montreal Maoist, I called myself. I believed in all that stuff. They have lost the mandate of heaven. That's what they talk about in Chinese history. With each new successive government, there's a moral code. You have to rule properly, or you lose the mandate of heaven, which means another dynasty will come in and defeat you and take over. And so I felt that's the moment when they've lost the moral authority to rule China.
I think China missed the best opportunity in history to actively, gradually, peacefully change that country toward direction, actively sharing universal values with other nations of the world.
On Tiananmen Square today, there's no sign of what happened 25 years ago. The scars of the tank tracks and the bullet holes were covered up long ago. When Beijing hosted the Olympics in 2008, the marathon runners followed in the footsteps of the soldiers who assaulted the square. A world which had shunned China after the massacre is beating a path to its door. At Tiananmen, the only hint of the approaching anniversary is on the side streets, where armed SWAT teams are lurking in case anyone should attempt public remembrance of an event China wants its people and the world to forget.
This year, for the 25th time, the anniversary of the massacre has been preceded by a wave of detentions. Parents seeking an accounting for their lost children, activists brave enough to speak out, even citizens attending private commemorations have been rounded up as June the 4th approaches. For all their power and wealth, China's leaders are still haunted by the ghosts of Tiananmen Square, the missed opportunity, and the unfinished business of 1989. For The National, I'm Patrick Brown.